Okay, so the stream is up as well. So today we'll talk about the malicious software, but before we talk about that, I think we should go back a little bit. Some of you took the course in computer security before, and then we talked about the concept of program security. Do you remember we talked about? There are two different reasons or objectives with program security. What are those objectives in program security? Do you remember? Or if you didn't take a course, can you guess? If you say program security, what could the objective be? No guessing? Okay, well, we have two objectives with program security. The first one is to try to develop programs without errors. So having good software development methodology, thinking about different ways we can do testing, we can do hazard analysis, we can use programming languages that help to eliminate bugs. So lots of different, what we call controls, to try to avoid developing software with bugs in them. So that's the first. The second one is try to develop software that is resistant to threats from outside. So they are hardened somehow. They can cope in an environment with malicious intent. And of course, a lot of that malicious intent would be from other software, malicious software. So that's what we'll talk about today then. So we'll talk about different types of malicious programs, and we'll talk about specifically virus and worms. We'll look a little bit more closely at, but we'll also look about different ideas about attack vectors, and a malware is often consisting of some way to spread itself, and then as another thing it has some type of payload. And the question is, that payload, what is that? What is the idea with that payload? What can we do about it? So we'll dive into that a little bit as well. And then at the end, as you see, we'll talk about DDoS attacks and countermeasures against DDoS attacks. And DDoS attacks is not directly malware, but they are often caused by malware or with the help of malware. So what is malicious program or malware? Well, in general talk we often say virus. Most ordinary people say, well, I have virus on my machine, when they actually mean that they have some type of malware, where virus is just one type, and then there are lots of other types as well. But virus have been some sort of the common word for all malware. There are lots of viruses, but there are also lots of other types of malware. There are different types of malware, so we can categorize them, but we'll see that the way they spread, the intent they have, what type of mechanisms used, there are different ways to classify them. So we'll look at that, and this is just one possible classification. There are other, but this is a quite simple one, and it helps us to get an idea about what we can have. So as you see, we start with all malware, and then we divide them dependent on one factor, and that is if the malware can work on its own, if it's independent, or if it needs to attach to something. It needs a host of some sort in order to live. So that's the first one. And then we have the second factor, and that is if malware is replicating or not. When replicating, we mean then that it makes a copy of itself, and then that copy makes a copy of itself to continue spreading. So we see that here we have some types in this classification, just to show how it works. So those that need a host program are, for instance, trapdoor, logic bomb, Trojan horses, and viruses. All of those require that you have some computing system with resources, and they can attach to these resources and use them. A virus can attach to different things. We'll look more on that. A Trojan horse typically needs to attach to either an operating system or some other program running in the system. A logic bomb can attach to anything. Any code that can run the logic bomb can attach to that, and so on. But then we have these types that are independent. They don't require something to hook onto. They can live on their own. And they are, for instance, worms and zombies. And we'll talk about those. They can live in a computer system without a host and even possibly spread. The second factor, replicating, is also very important, because that tells us one of the main objectives of some sort of malware, and that is to replicate. Viruses and worms and zombies all want to spread. That is the driving force behind that. They want to spread either within a computer system or to other computer systems. While the other three here, trapdoor, logic bomb, and Trojan horses, they don't spread at all. They are attached to a system, and that is where they are active, and they can do some harm. Then, of course, there can be combinations, which we'll talk about. We could have a virus that also brings a Trojan horse. And then, of course, the Trojan horse will spread and replicate together with the virus. But that is the second factor. So, and it's not the Trojan horse itself that spreads. How do we develop this malware? Well, in the beginning, they had to be created from scratch. And to be able to do that, you really need to have very good knowledge about computer systems, programs, different possible weaknesses, dig into that and to find ways to use them. But over time, this has been more and more automated using these attack kits. Toolkits that anyone can use. It's like using an Excel spreadsheet. You just run the program, you put in different parameters, and then you create the malware. And anyone can do that without very much knowledge, which means that we've seen an explosion of malware, of course, since so many now can create them. You can see the signature behind these toolkits when you investigate the malware. So you can see, okay, this one was created with that attack kit or that crimeware and so on. So there are families of different types of malware. And that can be used when we try to protect against them, because we can find the signature of these, and they can be more easily to find than real new malware. But they can be randomized so much that it can still be hard to find them. Especially if you talk about, as you see down here, they can be also actually active in that way that they are updated, these attack kits. So whenever new vulnerabilities are known, they are updated so they can create new malware based on new threats in different computer systems. So they can be very successful in that sense. If you look at the sources of attacks, why do people create malware? That has also changed over time. From initially it was just interest to explore possibilities. Can we make something that spreads? Can we make something that can enter a system or do something? But that is rarely the reason today. Today it's more, as you see, motivated by criminals trying to earn money, or it can be a different type of groups that are motivated by political reasons or whatever. So there's a real driving force behind the creation of malware today. It's not just for fun, which of course makes it more and more advanced threat. Also, since crime has come into it very lot, very big money in it, and that means that today we have organizations that are well funded, and that means they can create even more advanced malware. So it's a bad circle of organizations that are making money for this, and then they can create even better malware and making more money. So it's a tough competition that we have. The special type of these threats are these called advanced persistent threats, which comes from the idea that they are advanced attacks, not very simple one. They are persistent because they don't give up easily. They are quite targeted. They say that, okay, we would like to get into this organization to find bank accounts or whatever, so that we can get money from. And then they are persistent in that. They are testing different angles in order to get into that, and they are exploring, and they can work over time and do different things. So they don't give up very easily. So that's an advanced persistent threat. And that is also something that we see more and more. It also comes from crime organizations that really want to make money. So they are targeting where they can find the best money. They don't give up easily because they are well funded. But let's look a little bit on the different types of malicious code or threats that we have. So these are just a few that we'll look at. There are, if you look at the taxonomy, you will see that there are many, many more, but we'll go through these at least. So starting with a backdoor or a trapdoor. That is a way to get into a system without using the normal way in. And typically that backdoor trapdoor had to be actually developed when you develop a program. So you could see it as an error in the code because it deviates from the description of what the program should do. So it's really something that you missed in your program security when you would develop the program. But the intent may not have been malicious. It could be that the developer needed to test the program quite a lot. And to do that, he needed to find a way that he could make very efficient testing. So he bypassed some part of the program to be able to do that. That's why we had this backdoor trapdoor. And then they forgot to remove it when it was put in production. Of course, it could also be a malicious intent. It could be a software developer who would like to be able to get into the system later on. So he actually put the backdoor in by purpose. This type of threat is quite tough because it's really part of a software that you said that you installed it and you said it was something you would like to run. You have, as a user, no idea that there is a backdoor there typically. But you have okayed the application. The operating system asked you, you said, yes, this is an application I have. It's supposed to be able to use the internet, for instance. So once you have done that, it's very hard to stop it. Because the operating system couldn't know, couldn't help you, and you don't know what's going on. The only way to stop it is really to shut down all the possibilities of communication except the specific ones that you know that you should have. We'll look a little bit on that later on. Hej! Visst, ta dem bara. A logic bomb. One of oldest types. again, it's something that is embedded in a software already from the beginning, typically. It's not something that you add later on, although a logic bomb could be part of a virus, for instance, that is coming later on. But in many cases, it's there from the beginning. And it's called a logic bomb because it's something that is activated by some logic. There are different types of the ways to activate this. It can be presence of some file or absence of some file. So it can look in the environment in the computer system for different trigger points. It can be triggered by a certain time or date. It can be triggered by where the software finds itself, if it finds itself in a certain organization or certain country, whatever. So there are different trigger conditions for it. But there's always something that triggers it. So it stays idle for a time until it's triggered, and then the logic bomb has some type of payload that is activated. And that payload can be anything. Early logic bombs were these Easter eggs that you may have heard of, that were part of most early software, and that you could activate if you knew a certain way to press on the keyboard or something like that, or if you reach a certain level in the game, then it was activated. So as some type of reward to the user, you got a splash screen or something. Could be the developers of a program that had hidden a photo of themselves or something like that. Not very serious, perhaps, but something that software companies don't like, so they have worked hard to remove that from software today. And for a good reason, because you now have code in your program that is not documented, it's not part of a specification. That code can be used as a way to get into the software or attack it. So you don't want those added extra resources. And they also, of course, take up computing resources. But the payload has changed over time. So now it can be, for instance, that it starts deleting files or just crashes the system, whatever. More serious threats, of course. Then we have a Trojan horse. And that is in general a program with a hidden side effect. So it means there is a software that you said, okay, this is software I would like to use. You probably installed it yourself. But with that, when you did that, you also got a Trojan horse as part of that software. So this hidden side effect. And the Trojan horse can do different things. The Trojan horse could be a logic bomb, or the Trojan horse could be a trapdoor, or it could be something else. What the Trojan horse is doing is not part of a specification. It can be anything. So the main part here is that it's actually part of the software that you have installed, and it has a side effect that you are not aware of. But the best examples of Trojan horses are those that are given some type of backdoor that makes it possible for someone from outside to enter your system, or it's sending out data on its side channel that you don't have control over. Zombies. Programs that takes over a computer system. And it's doing that by replicating itself. So a zombie is targeting some resource of a computer system. A resource that has a limit, of course. Well, all resources have. But the idea is that we expose that resource, we use it that much so that the system finally crashes. And the resource can be hard disk storage, could be primary memory, it could be CPU cycles, could even be battery power if it's a mobile device, just trying to draw as much energy as possible from it. Sorry, I'm off here. That's not a zombie. What I'm talking about now is a bacteria. This one. Sorry. That is what is using the resources. If we go back then to zombie, that's, as you see, a program that is under control of someone else. So you allow a software into your computer that makes it possible for someone from outside to control you, like a zombie. And typically it's used then to for DDoS attacks, where you have a large amount of zombies that you can control, and then you can ask them to do something at the same time. We'll come back to that when we talk about the DDoS attacks. But let's look a little more closely at viruses, that type of malware. So it's at the basis then, as you see, it's a piece of self-replicating code attached to some other code. So that's the bare definition of a virus. Anything that replicates itself and attaches to some other resource would be a virus. Typically, the virus tries to spread either within a computer system by going from one file to another and infecting many files, typically program files, but could also be other type of files. But of course it would also like to spread to other systems. But unlike a worm, a virus couldn't directly spread from one system to another. So the way it can spread is that it will follow a host, a program that is copied from one system to another, and then the virus is attached and will follow. But it's not the virus itself that is spreading, it just follows. A virus typically have these different phases in its life. It starts with a dormant phase, and that is just as soon as it had spread to a new host, it stays dormant for a while. That is to try to not be identified. It will stay calm just to avoid being detected. That can be a short while or a very long time, depends on the virus. It has a propagation phase, and during the propagation phase, the virus tries to spread, replicate itself. Typically then by finding other programs in the same system that it can spread to. And then we have a triggering phase. These phases can overlap. So the virus can continue to spread while it's also in the triggering phase. So it depends a little bit on virus. But in the triggering phase, the virus is activated. So something has triggered the virus to execute its payload, whatever it's carrying. And the payload is then executed in the execution phase. So in the trigger phase, we're waiting for this condition to happen when we can execute the payload. And the execution phase, we do that. And the payload, as I said, can be anything. It can be that we just crash the system. It can be that we try to steal some information and send it out, or whatever. It can be really anything. Since the virus is working undercover, it tries to hide itself. Very different from a bacteria. A bacteria is very evident that we have a bacteria because we immediately see that the system is starting to slow down, we're starting to having troubles. A virus typically doesn't try to do that, unless if in the execution phase we would like to do something that crashes the system, whatever. But until then it tries to hide. But it has to find other programs, it has to attach to the system somehow, and those are often very system dependent. So it's both depend on all type of hardware I have, operating system, other programs. So that the entire environment is more or less a thriving ground for the virus. Really, as it is in human population, different viruses work different well in different situations. If you look at a very simple structure of virus, this could be it. We start here. We have a program, and that is the virus. We can see that the virus have different subroutines, different parts that make it, or different, let's just call them different parts. So we have one part here that says infect executable, and that is where we try to spread. We try to find a new host for a virus. We have another part that is called do damage, so that's the payload that we are doing, whatever that is. We have this trigger pull that is checking if it's time to do the payload or not. And then we have a main program here, down here, that starts with, okay, infect. So actually this simple example doesn't have a dormant phase. Immediately when we get into a system and have a chance to be executed, we try to infect. And if we go to infect, what we do here is we loop around looking for random executable files in the system. And then we look if the first line of that executable is this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is called a signature. Then we skip it. Otherwise, we add the entire virus to that file. Why are we doing this check here?
So that we don't have several viruses to the same file.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't, if we already have contaminated a file with a virus, we don't want to do it again. There were some early example of viruses that couldn't see that it already affected a file, and then it added itself time over time. So eventually the file just grew, and each time you activated the program, it had to go through all the different instances of the virus, so it's slowed down more and more. And that wasn't very efficient. So that created this idea that, okay, a virus needs to be able to identify itself. And a very easy way to do that is to put in this type of signature here, so it can find it. So that's the idea. So we execute to one other file, and then if the trigger condition is activated, then we do the damage. And then go to next. The next is just continue with the program. If you look at different types, we'll come back to this a little bit when we looked at how to spread actually. If you look at, there are many different types of viruses. We have parasitic, as you see, that are attaching to files. So that's the host. Typically another program then. We have this memory resident that hides in memory. And that means they need to hook on to something. I mean, just staying in memory isn't enough. If you put something in memory, it will never be accessed, right? So it means that in order to be in memory and have some way of actually executing, you need to make sure that that memory position will sometimes be executed. So you need to hook into some other programs. And you can do that because when you start a program, you load it up from the secondary storage and put it in memory. And then you can, of course, infect the program while it is in memory. And then you can put your self-virus somewhere else in memory. And whenever that application is run again while it's still in memory, the virus will also be activated. But you can also hook into other things. You could hook into operating system. So whenever operating system is doing some special activity, like say open file, then the virus can be activated, and then the virus have a chance to maybe infect that file. A virus that is memory resident will disappear when you reboot, because when you reboot and flush the memory, then it's lost. So it needs to have some other means of staying alive except the memory resident. But memory resident is nice because a typical way to deal with virus is to scan your hard drive. And then even if you have some antivirus software that can find the virus on the hard drive and remove it, it's still in memory, so it can just very easily infect you again. The boot sector virus is trying to hide in another place. It's trying to hide in the boot sectors of your boot up volume. And that is information that is not normally accessible when you're running the computer system. So an antivirus software may have problem of checking the boot sectors. It's only activated at boot time. There are ways to do it, but not the normal. It's not normally accessed by the normal file system, for instance. So that could be a way to hide, and also a way to be activated whenever you reboot the system. So a combination of memory resident and boot sector would probably be a good way, because then each time you boot up the system, it will get into the memory again, and then as long as you run it, it will be in memory. And then you close it down, you can get it back from the boot sector. Stealth virus specifically try to hide. I mean, the normal virus, of course, doesn't want to be shown. It doesn't want to be found, but it doesn't use special technology to try to hide from different type of antivirus software. But the stealth virus tries to do that, and we'll see some stealth techniques. Actually, both polymorphic and metamorphic are different stealth techniques. So polymorphic, as you see, is a way for the virus to mutate every new instance of it. Can you come up with some simple idea how we can write a polymorphic virus? How can we write a program that is changing each time we copy it?
Rename variables.
We can, yeah, that could be one way. Rename variables. If you just do it consistent, we can just create a new random variable and then just search and replace, and then, I mean, the program will still work fine. Other ideas? I got this question about zombies and botnet. We'll come back to that, Dimitri, so we'll talk about it later. Well, think about the program. Program X consists of subroutine subroutine A, subroutine B, subroutine C, and then some main here with different lines here. Okay. What is important, of course, when we write the polymorphic virus is that the logic shouldn't change when we change the program. It should still work the same way. But what we can do is, for instance, we can shift places on the subroutines here. Doesn't matter. We call them. Where they are in the code doesn't really matter. Another thing we can do is, if we look at the instructions that we have, the different lines here, we can see that sometimes we can rearrange them. It doesn't matter, again, within a program. It doesn't matter if we first put a value into variable A and then into B, or vice versa before we use them. So a lot of these rearrangement can be done at different levels. We can also put in what's called dead code. We can put in an entire subroutine that is never used. And then we can randomize the content of that as much as we want to. It doesn't matter what it says, because it will never be used. So we can just create random code, and it can grow and shrink, and it doesn't matter what it says. But it will change the program. And especially one way to look at ways to find virus code is to find signatures for them. We mentioned this one. Well, here the virus is very nice because it puts its own signature. And as soon as we find this virus and sees the signature, then we can easily find it. But if we don't have that type of signature, another way to identify it is to take a hash of a virus code. That could also be a good signature. But as soon as we start changing the code, then of course a hash will not be useful anymore. So that's a polymorphic. A metamorphic is even more advanced. As you see, it mutates again, as the polymorphic is doing. But it's not only rearranging itself on a more, well, I mean, the polymorphic will still have the same logic, even if it looks a little bit different. But with a metamorphic, we can also change the logic of a program. So it can be like genetic algorithms, if you know what that is. They are actually developing themselves. In each instance, they are changing itself to be more and more successful. And that is what we can combine here with virus. The virus that actually changes logics, trying new things and rearrange. That means probably that many of the new instances that are created will not be successful. Many of them may not even run at all. But some will be, and some will be better and better, and they will change. And that will make it even harder to find, because now actually the logic has changed as well. Another stealth technique is a compression virus. Because we have two ways to try to identify if we have the virus at all. Is to first look at the size of files in the file system. If we just have check on how big our files are, we can see if a file starts to grow suddenly. That is not a normal behavior. So if our instance of Word or our Internet Explorer, whatever, starts growing, well, that could be something. It could be a virus. So that is what a compression virus can handle, because what it's doing here in the first phase here is that we have a program that is contaminated with a virus here. CV is the compressed version of the virus code. Program 2 is a clean program. We would like to also attack P2. So at some stage we are actually running this infected program, and we find P2. Now we would like to attach to P2 without P2 growing. So what we do then is that we compress P2, and we compress it so much that we can attach this virus code to it, and the sum of the compressed P2 and virus code will be exactly the same size as the original P2. Of course, Now when we run P2, it won't run normally because P2 is compressed and compressed code couldn't run. But as we know, the first thing that happens when you execute the program is now that the virus code is run. So what the virus code is doing, that it will be in memory, it will decompress the rest of the program. So it will in memory be able to run, but on the stored file on the system is compressed. So that's one way to hide it. If continue with different type of virus, we have another type that's called a macro virus. They don't attack normal applications that most viruses doing. Instead, they are attacking different files that have some type of macro in them that can be executed. And we have these macros in different Office applications. We have them in PDF files, and there are other file types as well that have this macro capability. And that macro is really code, but it's code that is part of a normal document, not an application. So we don't normally see them as applications. But of course, since it's code and code that is actually executed, a virus have a chance to attack that as well. And we've seen that also in history, that there have been a number of these macro viruses that attack documents instead of files. And documents is some way better than applications, because we exchange documents much more than we exchange applications. So it's a better vehicle if you want to spread to other systems. Also, at least in theory, as you see in the second point, they are platform independent. If we have a Word document with a macro, in theory it could go from a Windows instance and spread to a Macintosh computer, which is something that is quite rare otherwise for viruses. They are very platform dependent. But that is only in theory, because if you look at it in reality, there are very few macro viruses that have actually been able to spread from one platform to another, because when they are run in that new environment, nothing looks the same. I mean, files are different places, the file system, all the system variables on all of things are different. So in order to actually work in another environment, the virus really need to know about all the different types of systems beforehand and take that into account when it spreads. And since that is the case, you might as well have written the code specific for different platforms from the beginning. So it's not a very big difference actually. We also have something called email viruses, which typically is some type of macro virus, but it's just spread by the email system. So what you have is an email with some attachment, and that attachment have code that can be executed. Of course, the attachment doesn't have to be a normal document with macro code. It can be another application with normal code, but it will be executed when you open up the attachment. And unfortunately, some years back now, email system worked in that way that when the email was arriving, the email system would like to help the user by presenting information about an email in some sort. And then it actually started to decode the mail. And then it could also execute this code, the virus code. So the user didn't even have to open the email itself. The email system did the processing for the user, and the virus could spread. That is better today. I think all the mail system is stopping the system from actually activating any code. Okay, so let's take a break here, because now we're moving over from virus to worms instead. So let's take a 15-minute break here, and then we'll continue with that. Independent or dependent?
The zombies was inside the independent ones, but the definition of them is like they need an outsider to control them.
A zombie needs an outsider to control them, yes, but they don't need a host, they don't need to be attached to something in the computer system where they are. They can live on as their own process in the system.
Okay, that's the additional function.
Yeah, that they can be controlled from outside is an additional function. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
kör på i konsolen alltså. Du kan inte skriva något så här. Ja, jag vill fixa det. Bergen. Ja, för massor av kanske. Vad har du suttit snart? Tungt. Ja. Ja. Ja, det är fan svårt. Ja. Är det hissing i bilen? Ja, jag tror det var andra ord. Så du behöver kasta ut det genom
Okay, so moving on from viruses to worms instead. Worms and viruses are very similar in many ways, but there is a big difference, and that is the virus needs this host. It needs to attach to a host, while a worm does not need a host. And typically, a virus mainly infects one application to another in the same computer system, while a worm typically infects from one machine to another machine over the network. So a worm needs the network. The worm has similar phases like the virus, dormant, a propagation, but now the propagation is then different. For the propagation phase for virus, it typically looks for another file in the local system that it can attack, while the propagation of worm now tries to identify another system, another host in the network that it can connect to and infect. So the propagation phase, first it tries to identify possible vulnerable other hosts, and then it tries to establish a connection to them and replicate onto that system. Now, to do that, I mean, the worm itself runs as its own process in the first system. So that's why it doesn't need a host. It runs as its own process, its own application. When it wants to get to another system, that means it needs to be able to start up a new process in that system and get its code over to the other side. So typically what it needs is some type of protocol that makes it possible for one host to contact another one, send over information, and then get that activated, executed on that other system. So a worm is dependent on different type of protocols and services that are network services that it can connect to and send over information to and then be activated. So that's a propagation phase. And then similar, it has a triggering phase. Once it has a hold on a new system, it can trigger to do something, and then that will be the execution phase with the payload, whatever that is. To find these targets that it should try to spread to, a worm can have quite a lot of different types of ideas on how to do that, different strategies, as you see. It can do a random, so it just randomly checks for other IP addresses on the internet to try to connect to. It can have a hit list. That means that we can already from the beginning, when we write the worm, also pass on a list of hosts that it would like to infect. And then we can try to infect those first. If we can't infect them, could be because we have no access to them, then we try to spread somewhere else, and then again we try can we now have access to it? So we try to make the worm move around the net until we can reach the ones that we're actually after. We can do a topological discovery. That means that we are, once we get into a system, we try to find the information about other hosts that are connected to that. We find in logs, we can find in different network configuration files on information about other hosts that we know about. Those can be interesting to try to attack because our host can be a trusted host by those other hosts, and that makes it where one can easily target those. And we can do the local subnet. We try to spread in the local environment. And that is an effectful strategy because in a local network we are typically not protected by firewalls. The firewall is protected against the outside, but in the local network we can easily spread from one computer to another without a firewall stopping us. But typically we need a mix of those, because if we only do local we would never break out and spread onto the internet. So a mix of those is typically what we have. This shows a typical propagation behavior for a worm. We start down here initially with very few infected hosts. We start with just one, of course, where we release the worm. And then it takes a very long time before anything really starts happening. That first instance of worm tries to find a way to get to somewhere else. And then, hopefully, from the worm's perspective, it succeeds at some time. And then we're spread to one more. And now from that one, we continue to try to spread. So now we have two trying to spread, and then some of them will succeed and it starts to pop up. And then, of course, we will have this exponential growth after a while. And then we have this, what we call the fast spread phase, and this is where we spread mostly. It will be limited, and eventually it will start to slow down. And the reasons for that are several different reasons. One reason is that in a local context, we have found all the possible victims. So in the local context, we can't find any new hosts to spread to. And if we are very successful, that will even be true on a global scale. We have found all the possible victims really out there. But typically what happens is that it starts to slow down, because once we get to this fast spread phase, the worm starts to get attention. And once the eyes are upon it, different antivirus companies will investigate and try to find remedies for it, and they will push that out to different anti-malware software. And after a while that takes effect, and that will eventually slow down the worm as well. So this behavior is very similar to virus behavior as well, this propagation model. Yes?
Will the worms also identify if the other host is already, if it already have been infected or not?
Yeah, the worm is doing the same thing as a virus. When it contacts a host, it will try to see if it already has been able to spread to that, and then it will stop at that stage. So yeah, it's doing the same thing. It tries to find the signal somehow so it don't spread again. An example of a worm is the Morris worm. You see, it's quite old now, from 1988. But it was the first very successful worm. It, as you see, targeted Unix systems. And in the propagation phase, it actually used 3 different techniques to try to propagate from one system to another. So it used the simple password cracking on a local password file. So once it got hold of the system, it looked at the password file that I have in that system to try to crack the passwords of it. And then we have username and password combination, and then you can just remote log in to other systems that have the same users. So that would work in a local context. Secondly, it exploited the finger protocol. On a Unix system, you have a daemon running that's called finger, and you can, from any machine, you can send a request to that Unix workstation and ask about information about a certain user. So I can finger a Unix machine for the user root, for instance, and then it will respond back saying, yes, user root exists, real name is this one, it resides in this library, and so on. How much information revealed is of course up to the administrator of that system, but it was a way to check who is on another system. But there was a bug in that made it possible to send in code and actually get activated on that other system as well. And then third, if that failed, it also tried send mail, which, as you know, is used to send email with SMTP protocol. And again, it was a trapdoor in that system that it found, that it made it possible to get into send mail. So it wasn't using actually the SMTP protocol, but it was using a trapdoor in the send mail program to get in. So whenever it got into a new system, it tried these different 3 techniques in order to continue to find other systems. It was actually very successful from a one's point of view. And it was actually more successful than intended, because the author who wrote it thought that, well, yeah, this could probably be quite successful. It can probably spread to a lot of Unix systems. but his intention was just to see if he could do that. It didn't have a payload, so it wasn't any malicious payload with the worm, it was just spreading. But the funny thing is that his mistake was actually that he made a program bug. He made a program error when he wrote the virus in the triggering phase. Or, well, we can say in the dormant phase. His idea was that it should quite slowly replicate. So it would, once it got hold on the system, it would wait for quite a long time before it continued with the next system. But there he made a bug, which meant that it was very aggressive. And it spread throughout the internet in just hours. It was noticed that things were happening here. Lots of systems, a lot of traffic from this worm. And it actually slowed down, and parts of the internet routers on crashed because of the load of all this traffic. So it was found out very, very soon, and it cost a lot of money to repair all these systems. I had to shut down more or less the internet for a couple of days. And funny detail here is that the guy who wrote it was a high school student whose father was working with IT security with the government in the United States. So that was an unusual twist, perhaps. So that was a famous one, but there have been quite a lot of other worms as well. So as you see, over time, a lot of different worms have been developed, all of them exploiting different bugs, typically in services, network services running. Quite a lot of them, as you see, have been targeting Microsoft systems. The internet web server, Microsoft web server, the Microsoft SQL server, and Windows directly and so on. So Microsoft has been quite exposed to this, but also some have has been against Unix systems. We don't see that many new worms today. There are still coming new worms, but not that many, and not as successful as they were here in the early 2000s, when their defense lines were much less effective. But we still have them, and they are using different techniques here, as we see. They are more or less multi-platform, because we are targeting services, and those services typically target bugs in libraries, different network libraries for SSL or whatever. And those are often multi-platform. You use them in different platforms. So they can be multi-platform. Multi-exploit, like we see in the Morris, they are trying to exploit. That one was using 3 different techniques to spread. They often try more than one at least. They can be very fast to spread. They can be polymorphic and metamorphic again, trying to hide. They are often today transport vehicles for different payload. So they're not just like the Morris one trying to spread, they also have something with them. And quite often they are what we call a zero-day exploit. What does that mean? Anyone know what a zero-day exploit is?
It's like when the software is initially released, so like there are no patches, nothing out yet, like just before the release.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be that the software is just released, but there is a new bug identified somewhere.
0 days to fix it.
Hmm?
Then you have 0 days to fix it.
Yeah, well, no, since the exploit is not known by the author yet, it's still open for attack. So a worm author would look for new zero-day exploit, new vulnerabilities that are not known in software. And once they found one, they write a new malicious software that exploits it, and then it releases it. And at that stage, it's a zero-day exploit because no one knew about it, no one could defend against it. What will happen typically is that after a few days, it's known and remedies have been put in, both from the author of a program that had the exploit, but also antivirus software trying to patch it and so on. But it's always good from a malware author point of view to find these zero-day exploits, because as long as they're not known to anyone, you can easily exploit them. But they, I wouldn't say daily perhaps, but quite often there are these exploits that are published. And sometimes they are only found by malware authors. Sometimes a researcher find them, and then they try to of course tell the manufacturer of the software to try to patch it before it's well known. But there's always a race to try to find them. We also have worms on mobile systems, and there have been not that many, but there have been a few to try to attack direct smartphones by either, as you see, the multimedia services, SMS, MMS, or a direct connection with Bluetooth or other communication channels that it has. One example is this ComWarrior that used Bluetooth to spread from one phone to another directly using Bluetooth. So you had to be within 10 meters something to get attacked. And it also uses MMS. So once it got into a new phone, it checked the phone book and then sent messages to everyone on that phone book, trying to attack those as well. And it was relatively successful, actually, that one. If this is, we talked about mobile phone worms, but let's talk about mobile code. That is completely different. Mobile code is, as you see, program script macro that runs unchanged on different type of platforms. So it can attack, for instance, both Windows and Mac OS. Then it's a mobile code because it can move from one platform to another. Or it can even be called mobile code, as you see, if it can attack, say, both Windows 95, Windows 7, Windows 2010, whatever. So it can work in different instances of the same in the same family. Then it can still be called a mobile code because it has a larger scope than just focusing on one version. But otherwise, it's no difference to other types of malware. Drive-by downloads is another type. Exploits browser vulnerabilities. So when you go to a web page, accidentally, you can get code installed on that one. So it's not an active threat, it's more an passive threat. And actually just in the break here I accidentally found one. So I'm going to show that to you. I was just going into, as you see, the Kahoot to see if I could find a nice Kahoot for today. And if I press enter here, this happens. Oh, dear Telia user, you have been chosen to take part in an investigation. And you can win an iPhone. Nice. Okay. So just press X here and yes and okay, so you can win this. So this is a typical example of a drive-by. What was the problem? Well, the problem was that I misspelled Kahoot. Yeah, exactly. So just by misspelling that, that's a typical way to try to do. You look at famous domain names and then you do different variations, different misspellings of it and put it this. In the hope that some will do this and then say okay. If I do press OK here, there is a risk that I will have some malicious code installed. Especially since I'm on a Windows machine now that are much more exposed to these than my normal Mac is. So I won't press OK. But it's not sure that that is enough. Just by going here, I could actually have been attacked now, even if I don't say OK. I'm here, depending on my browser and my settings in the machine, I could already have malware now. But let's close it down just.
And it's also secure, so it's secured by some certificate.
Yeah, exactly. It's a secure malware. So I think I will better ask IT to have a look at this computer then later on to see if actually something got in here. Okay, so that's a drive-by. Or we can also call it a phishing site. I mean, they fish for people coming in and try to lure them. Spam, you already know about. We don't have to talk about it much. Multiple threat malware, when you combine different techniques here to make a malware work in many different ways, combining different attack targets, but it can also combine, it can be both a virus and a Trojan horse and maybe a zombie, something like that. We combine many different things. So that makes it more potent, of course, but not necessarily better from a malware point of view, because you show more. You have more things going on in the system, so you will be more easily detected typically. But let's concentrate a little bit on the payload, because we said that, well, a virus can have a payload, a worm can have a payload. We can get in the payload in many different ways. But what is that payload? What does it do? Well, once we are active in the system, there are different reasons for why we would like to have that malware into the system and what we want to do. Can try to extract information, it can try to destroy things. So there are different ideas. So let's look at some of the typical examples here of payload. An attack agent is a typical payload where we insert something that can turn that machine into a bot or a zombie or a drone. There are different names for it. That makes it possible to control it from outside. And why we would like to do that can be of different reasons. It could be that we would like to, for instance, mine for bitcoins. Then we can use a large zombie army of computers to mine bitcoins for us. Or we can use the zombies in a DOS attack to attack someone else. So there are different reasons for why we would like to have these controlled systems. Other reasons are spamming, a way to explode spam by using lots of relays, and then we can really send out huge spam traffic. We can sniff traffic with them. All the bots can listen to local traffic to see what's going on. And that means we can get in behind firewalls to see what is actually going on in the local network, typically unencrypted, even if we use VPN, like IPsec we talked about last week. They can do keylogging, extract the information, see what is done on that machine, and maybe we'll see when a person is going to log into his bank account and typing passwords to that or whatever. So there are a lot of reasons for why we would like to use a bot actually. if we have a bot, we need to be able to control it somehow. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a bot. Then it would just be a system running for its own. So that's the important distinguish from a bot from a worm. But a worm isn't directly controlled by someone. It works independent. But the bot is controlled from the outside. That means we need to have some form of communication from the author to the bot. There are different ways to do that. Let's see. One way to use an internet relay chat server or this public IRC service where you can post things and the bot could just listen to a certain channel for a certain message, and when they see a certain message that looks very unsuspicious. It's just a message saying that my grandmother had her 19th birthday today, something like that. That could be the trigger point for the bot to do something. So we can have a number of these triggers. But we can also use other connection like HTTP. We can set up a web server somewhere and then they just ask that web server. It's not strange that a host on our network sends out an HTTP request to a web server somewhere. I mean, that happens all the time. We have users using the browsers to go to different web servers around the world. If a bot is part of what's running on a machine and the bot makes an HTTP request, nothing strange. We can also use distributed control mechanisms, different peer-to-peer networks and so on. Because if we use a web server or we use a IRC channel, that's one single point of failure. And if someone finds out that, okay, we have a botnet here that is controlled by that web server, we can just close down that web server and then the botnet would be without any control. So a distributed control mechanism is possible for the botnet to survive people trying to attack it. An important point is when you are trying to investigate the botnet is trying to see how the bots are controlled. And so that's a way to stop the botnet. So for that reason they try to hide that communication channel, and they can move and change channel, and they can do that with encrypted code. So even if you investigate the bot code, you couldn't see what is happening until it's actually executed. So you would need to have it executed and live, see what's going on. It can be very complicated, but it's a weak point for the botnet, of course, because it needs to have this communication with the control. So that's an attack engine. Another type of payload would be the information theft. And see, there are different ideas for that. But the idea is that we get malware into the system and then it extracts some type of information and sends it out to someone. It's not controlled, so we don't send in commands telling him to do. It's just extract information and send it out. And there are different versions of that, as you see. Stealthing payloads, trying to typically to form these backdoors where we try to hide in the system but making it possible to get into the system using backdoors, so we don't need to use the normal communication means in order to get into the system. There are other stealth techniques as well, but that's the typical one. Another stealth technique is this rootkit, which is a type of malware that really focuses on trying to attack a system and be very deep into the system and at the same time try to hide itself. A rootkit typically needs to somehow seize root capability in order to do that. Otherwise, it's quite hard to get that deep into a system. But typical rootkit behavior is to attack the operating system and attack typical commands like list files, list processes that you have. I mean, you have these things in the background operating system that can do. You can reach them by the command console, but you can also reach them by an API. So for instance, in Windows, you can at the console type list files in a directory, but you can also go into applications that are looking at all the current running processes on. But they're all using the capability of operating system to know about what processes are running and so on. Now, a rootkit would hook into these routines and change them. So when you ask the operating system to list files in the directory, it will list all files, but it will not show the files that belong to the rootkit. So it will hide in that way. And when you're asking for which processes are running, all processes but the rootkit will show up, because the rootkit hides it from the user. So those are different ideas on how to write the rootkit. And again, rootkits are in some ways similar to have some similar capabilities as various, just that they hook deeper into the system, and really the main focus is trying to hide that they are. And then they often have a payload. They do something else, extract the information, whatever, but they try to really be very stealthy. Protection then. Well, this is not very deep, unfortunately, but there are some pointers here. Have virus protection of different anti-spyware, anti-spybot, anti-adware. There are lots of these anti-programs that you can have that tries to target different type of malware. Of course, keep them updated. Limit what you can do on a system in terms of what you can execute. The last point is one that I have taken to heart. Not use the most common operating system and email programs on, because those are the ones that is actually most targeted by hackers. So dig up an old Commodore 64, something like that, and run that, and you will be quite safe. The best countermeasure is prevent, of course, to make sure that nothing gets into my system. But unfortunately, that will not always succeed. Not least because these zero-day attacks, because you couldn't really protect against those, because you don't know about them. So whenever that fails, you need to go into the second phase here. And then is first to detect that something is going on, which in itself is not always easy. I mean, if we have these rootkits that are really hiding themselves, it's not obvious that we have been attacked. So we need to have different ideas on how to detect that something is going on. And that probably means that we couldn't just look for known malware. We have to look at the system and see what is the behavior of my system right now. Is it behaving normally, or is something going on? Does it use more power than it should do? Is it opening more files? Is there some type of network traffic that is out of the normal? And we need to have these type of anti-malware applications that look for these different types of changes in the behavior and can warn us about that. So once we have detected that, okay, something is going on here, well, then we need to identify it. It's not enough to know that, okay, we are attacked by something. We need to identify what it is, and if there are known ways to handle it. And then hopefully we can also remove it and restore. But that's not always possible. I mean, if we have a ransomware, for instance, that has encrypted everything, well, obviously we see that we have been attacked. But as long as if we don't pay for the encryption, it's probably possible to get back. I mean, they're using strong encryption, so if they didn't make a mistake in their code, we probably couldn't remove it. We have to wipe and start from the beginning. But let's look a little bit on the scanners that look for this malware. See, there have been different generations of it. The first generation were just very simple one, looking for these signatures that we saw in this virus example. A simple signature that we can see, okay, this is actually a virus, it's a well-known virus, and then we can find it. So typically checked for executable files on the hard drive only. The second generation, as they call heuristic scanners, look for more general signs. So, but again, we are scanning the hard drive to see is something affected, but it's not only looking for specific signs, more general. For instance, compression code or encryption code that is used by different type of malware. See, can we find that type of code here? Well, that could be a signature that we actually have been attacked. Can also, as you see, look for checksum and hash changes, so we can see if files have changed. The third generation with activity traps, that means that we're not only scanning the hardware now and then, we're actually resident in the system and checking what is going on all the time. As soon as there is a new network contact, someone opens up a file, whatever, we are looking for that to see, okay, is this okay or not? Is something malicious here? And then the fourth generation, what's called full-featured then. We combine all the different techniques, and we also connect to an ecosystem where we can get help from the manufacturer of antivirus system, get updates, get help with identifying new malware and so on. Part of this antivirus system could be behavioral blocking software I talked about, looking at the behavior of what's going on and try to see if a behavior is strange. And that can work for any new type of virus. So that is a good idea. And then we can look for different types of behaviors. We can look for whenever a person is active on the system, or how many files we typically open per day, or how often we change password. All of these different activities we can look for, and that will form an idea on the behavior, what is a normal behavior in this system and what is not normal. And whenever we see something that is not normal, we can warn about it. In a system, we can also, if you look at the larger system, we can monitor what's going on, because it's often traffic in and out. We talk about the network tuple in this course. So it's traffic entering or leaving our system that is extra interesting to look at. And both inbound traffic and outbound traffic is interesting to look at. So an ingress monitor will look at the incoming traffic. And that is why, of course, we look for active attacks against us. Someone from outside trying to get in by attacking us, inserting a new malware in the system. But the egress monitor is also important, because in the egress we can see traffic from inside going out. And here we can detect, for instance, a zombie that is trying to contact its control machine, or we can see an infected machine on the inside trying to spread virus to someone on the outside. And that can be important that we see what is going on from our system out. Otherwise, if other people see that a lot of attacks coming from us, for instance, DDoS attacks coming from machines in our system, we might be shut down. So it's important to see both in and outgoing traffic. Well, the same as for the various, the different classes here. We have the similar for worms, of course, signature based, and then a little bit more advanced We can also look at more at the behavior with threshold random walk or rate limiting, rate halting. That is more what we do if we encounter something. Rate limiting, for instance, could be that if we see that a certain host opens up a lot of connections to the outside, we can limit that to a certain level. So it's only allowed to open, say, 5 new HTTP sessions per minute or whatever. That is a rate that is normal. So by limiting the rate, we can reduce the effect of a malware. Or we can go to even to rate halting and say that, okay, now that machine have done so much of a certain type, so now we have to stop it. We have to investigate it, but we can automatically do that halting before we have to go in and manually check it. These are examples of where we can put in our worm defense. Here we can talk about, here we have an internet, we can have a remote sensor out somewhere on the internet, not in our own system but somewhere else. We can use that to compare what traffic is going in here and what is seen on other places, or we can use this as an early alert that now something is going on the internet and we can try to protect us before it reaches us. In our we have, of course, the firewall, that is all traffic is flowing through, and there we can have also filtering and sensors seeing what for different type of traffic patterns. We can specifically have passive sensors in the network looking for worms, for instance. We can have these honeypots, and that we'll also see when we come back to firewalls later on, that honeypot could be an important part of a firewall system, where we try to lure the threats from the internet to attack the honeypot instead of attacking our own systems. As part of this, we can also have this sandbox environment where when a new code arrives from outside, before we allow it to actually execute in our environment, we first run it in a sandbox. We can investigate the behavior of it in a contained environment where it couldn't do any harm. And it's only after we run that for a while and we have investigated that we decide if we actually should allow it to execute in our environment or not. So these are some parts of an entire system for worms. It's similar for viruses or other malware. So we need to have a broad spectrum of defenses for any type of malware, actually. Last little bit on denial of service, or maybe we can wait with that since it's 12 o'clock. Yeah, it's the last bit. So let's save that for next week. Are there any questions about malware so far? Let's just make a short poll here. How many of you have been attacked by a virus? Okay, most have. Other types of malware? Yeah, a few. It's not always easy to know perhaps exactly what type it is, but you probably what you see is that your machine starts to behave strangely, and it starts to crashes or it slows down, and then just look for it. Sometimes you can find the cause, sometimes you can find exactly what it is and how to remove it, but in other situations you just give up and reinstall. I've seen some of those stories in the pre-assignment. I'm reading them and will compile them hopefully later this week, so you can read these other stories. There are some interesting stories there, actually. So, but I guess most actually have encountered some malware, even if we not always know about it, actually. Okay, for the rest of the week we have lecture on Thursday again. But you don't have any tutoring this week, is it? There is an introduction, okay. And let's see, did he post it? We talked about the last week that he should post the second assignment. It is, okay, good. I didn't have time to see that it was posted. So, yeah, you have something new to dig your teeth into then. Okay, see you on Thursday then.